book discussion, the biography of Ralph Waldo Emerson, A Mind on Fire by Richard D. Richardson. This is a great book. This is actually a fantastic book, and I've spoke quite a bit about this book already. So this review hopefully can summarize the most important impressions I got from the book, but also hopefully I can avoid duplication. So I want to start with the appraisal of the actual author, Richard D. Richardson, who did a fantastic job, because this is a book about a poet. And if I told you just totally independently, you're going to spend, I don't know, 500-600 pages reading about the life of a poet, you might probably think, okay, how am I going to survive this? Like, how can this be interesting? And of course, every story, every book lives and dies with the story itself. So you can have a good story about a warrior, you can have a good story about a poet, you can have a good story about a prostitute, you can have a good story about a scientist. I think the person's life is the story. And in Emerson's case, this is in many ways true. First, his life is amazingly interesting, but more importantly also, he himself is an advocate of the personal experience, the actual individual's experience and reflection of life and truth. So in that sense, he would totally subscribe to my impression here that I got from the book, that the quality of this book and the great read it is mainly attributable to Ralph Waldo Emerson's life and his amazing contributions. That shouldn't diminish the author's work. I mean, it's not easy to write a book like this, no matter what. All I'm trying to say here is that I think, literature is the art of telling stories, and there's not much of a difference between a biography, a novel, a memoir. These are just marketing slogans for, putting books on shelves in bookstores. But what really matters is the story, and whether it's a real story or not is almost irrelevant. In this case, it is a real story. Ralph Waldo Emerson's life, as read through his writings, that's the great thing. I'm not a poet myself. I'm not a poetry aficionado, but I do appreciate poetry, and I think I'm not alone in the world with that. I think poetry is very difficult to assess, but short, spicy aphorisms that poetry sometimes produces, or just to use a scientific term, the concept of Occam's razor, which is the ability to express something in very short, concise, compressed form, I think it's beautiful. And I think we all resonate with that kind of beauty. So if somebody is able to bring a poet like Emerson to me, or to many people like me who are interested, who probably have read a few books here and there, but who just aren't poetry aficionados. I don't understand poetry that well. There's a lot of poetry that you might only be able to enjoy if you really understand the context. And I think this book does a fantastic job at putting the beautiful poetry of Ralph Waldo Emerson in context, which gives you this beautiful understanding of what's actually going on. So I wrote down a list of many quotes that I remembered from the book. It's in the show notes. I think what I want to focus on here is the impression that I got from the writing of this book, which is most importantly that poetry is the most intelligent form of verbal expression. I think that will be the first thing I want to talk about. And this is really important. This goes beyond just, the pastime or hobby or well, I had a nice time reading this book. I mean, this is really important because we're working on AI. I mean, here at Orange Capital Partners, we are fully invested in developing intelligent systems, investing in companies that do that, developing intelligent systems ourselves. So we're very, very much invested in this. And this book is actually really important because Occam's razor and poetry are a nice allegory for what's coming, which is this ability to express important concepts in short ways, which is really what intelligence is. But I want to focus on this book now and not talk too much about the business and AI and things like that. But just for new listeners, why is the Not Even Wrong podcast talking about, poets here? The purpose of the Not Even Wrong podcast is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. That's the purpose of the podcast. We've been around for about a little bit more than 5 years, and this is what we've been doing. It's going really well in terms of us excited about doing this. That's the most important metric. And the reason we do this is for two reasons. I think one is we want to keep a record of our own thinking and also hopefully inspire people to have one more option to think about how they want to go after starting a business in the hedge fund industry. The other main thing I think that this book brings with it is the importance of language as a means of expression. I think we sometimes take this for granted. Language has been around way before speech. This is, I think, some famous person said that. I can check who did that. But language has been around way before speech. What does that mean? That means that we have the species on this world, humans, but other forms of life, trees, whatever, they have figured out a way to communicate with each other way before humans actually developed speech. And I'm not sure if we're the only species that has speech. I think whales have some sort of speech, but the concept of speech is just a compressed form of communication. Trees communicate with chemicals. Bees communicate obviously with them. Ants communicate with smells and chemicals and things like that. So there's a lot of ways to communicate. Speech is just a very compressed form, and poetry is the mother of all compressed forms. So it's the most intelligent way of the most intelligent species on Earth, which is humans, to communicate with each other. So I think that's the first big takeaway here. The beauty of poetry comes across in this book. This is, I think, the great job that the author did, is to bring this to the reader in a very palatable way in the context of the history. Let me talk a little bit about the history. So Waldo Emerson is born at the turn of the 19th century, so early 19th century. So he is a child of the new United States of America. And he is the one that writes the intellectual Declaration of Independence. And this is very, very important. The subtitle of the book, A Mind on Fire, I think it's really telling. I think Emerson's mind was on fire. He had this unbelievable ability to use poetry to express views and beauty and political views. And, he's the proverbial, verbal SWAT team. You send him somewhere and he's gonna mincemeat anybody who stands in his way, verbally, of course. So a very powerful weapon in a time when eloquence, poetry, debate is becoming the main means of politics, because that's what a democracy is. And I promised in one of the earlier episodes to talk a little bit about the context of today, because where do we stand today? We have, let's just take the concept of debate, right? What does debate mean today? It certainly doesn't have the value and the importance it had back in the first part of the 19th century, when I think, given the history that I read here and other histories, debate really was cherished because it was a new thing. It was something people, particularly in the United States, actually appreciate, because it divided our country from everybody else, in particular the kingdom, England, the kingdom, and the country that the colonists liberated themselves from, and that the colonists desperately wanted to be different from. Now today, unfortunately, I think debate has been diminished to a sort of wrestling match where we pretend to debate, but behind the curtains there is a political class which is slowly gutting this country. We've also seen the murder of Charlie Kirk, which is a symbol of debate, and the opponents of that, whether it's a lone terrorist or the organized terrorism, doesn't matter. What's clear is that people understand the importance of debate. Clearly, they wouldn't have killed Charlie Kirk otherwise, but they don't accept it anymore. So that's where we stand today, and I think Emerson would be very shocked if he came back today and saw what we did with our democracy. 40 trillion in debt, bipartisanship doesn't exist anymore, there's no such thing. There's a divided country, and I think one more important thing historically, it's actually very similar to the pre-Civil War era, which was back then focused on one issue, which was the issue of abolishing slavery. Today it's more than that, one issue, but it's very similar. So in that sense, maybe I'm contradicting myself now, but I still think that the concept of debate back then had a little bit more weighing than it has today. Unfortunately, back then they chose weapons to solve the issues that they had, and I think the author goes through that. For example, the Fugitive Slavery Acts, which were opposed in the North, and then with Lincoln coming to power, the push towards the Emancipation Act, which then legitimized the Civil War for many intellectuals, including Emerson. So again, this is a beautiful, I think, testament of history, and I think it's important. I think, Emerson, one of his quotes is that the value of history is to connect our present with our past and give ourselves some sort of ground truth, some sort of root system of, okay, this is where we come from, and we better understand where we come from. And the path where we go, it's not a Markovian process. It does depend where we come from. Another important thing, which is not discussed in the book, but I just want to mention, very important, I took that up in my own novel, Cyberpunk, the fact that rewriting history actually is a very, very strong political act and very, very dangerous political act. Unfortunately, we've also seen that happen in recent times, particularly during the pandemic, when the woke mob movement started rewriting history, and we had the culmination of that, debacle when Google issued a generative AI model that showed our founding fathers being women and black women and things like that, which is, rewriting history right in your face. Rewriting history is dangerous because who controls the past controls the present, and who controls the present controls the future. So basically there's control everywhere, and that's not a good thing. I think the third thing I want to talk about is the importance of liberty and freedom, which is really what Emerson's poetry actually encompasses. That's why it's called the Declaration of Independence. It's literally a declaration of independence. It's a declaration of independence of the mind, and it's the declaration of independence of the social consciousness of the United States from Britain and Western European thinking, but also the declaration of independence of the individual from his or her surroundings. So the individual is front and center, which is very, very important. I think the difference between the United States of America and Europe and Canada and Australia and you name it, all these Western countries that look and feel similar to ours but are very different, I think it goes back to the roots of course, the founding fathers and the Constitution, but then people like Emerson who actually wrote the intellectual, the soul of this Constitution. Because the US Constitution is just a piece of paper with a bunch of, it's great, but it's still just a piece of paper. The soul, the mission, the identification with the ideas had to be earned over decades and written down by poets like Emerson, and then later on Melville in his seminal book Moby Dick, which is the book of the 19th century that encompasses America and the rise of America as we know it today. So what are the ingredients that are so important here? Of course, self-reliance. the individual. But, very often we hear these things, particularly me as having grown up in Europe, people like to, shortcut everything and say, America is all about the individual. It's about me, ego, me. And to some extent that's true, but, which country is not about me? Which country is not driven by egoism? That's not what differentiates America. What differentiates America is the independence of the mind, is the idea that knowledge, the truth, nature, manifests itself in everybody, in each one of us. The same way that England formulated that each man's house is his castle, which is the fundamental idea that your property is yours. You can't be trespassed. The state cannot come, which later on turned into the Second Amendment, which again, it's not just about bearing arms and things like that. It's about the ability to defend yourself against intruders. And the same concept applies to the mind. And if you will, Emerson is the Second Amendment of the mind. I have the right to defend myself against the intrusion of doctrine, of religion, of totalitarian, ideas, or even any ideas that don't resonate with myself. This is self-reliance, but I do have, of course, self-reliance also. I'm accountable to my actions. I can't go back and say, well, it was just, I was taught this. I mean, it wasn't they told me to do this. In Emerson's world, there's no such thing. In Emerson's world, there are no Nuremberg processes. In Emerson's world, there is no apologizing for genocide, no matter on which side it's being conducted on. Because it's the individual that bears the full responsibility for her actions in any circumstance. And you can be a prison guard during the Nazi regime. You can say, look, I did it because I needed to protect my family, but I'm not going to use excuses. And then you judge me the way you want to judge me. You can kill children in a war because you have to survive, but you don't justify it with some other reason than the one that you chose to do this. It was your choice. You have the choice. I think choice and free will, and what later on manifests itself in East of Eden and Steinbeck's passage when Lee talks about the Hebrew translation, you mayeth. Like you mayeth choose, like you have the choice. I think the word choice resonates throughout Emerson's life, and that is the Declaration of Independence, the intellectual Declaration of Independence. You have a choice. And I think that's the reason why America has been a magnet for so many people, still is. It's not because we're rich. It's not because, people in Guatemala don't have, food to eat or any of that stuff. I mean, there's some of that. There's always economic refugees from poorer countries to richer countries, but that's not the kind of immigration that America was built on. The immigration that built America is the one that, the magnet that was seeded by people like Emerson, people who sought that kind of self-reliance, who sought the ability to make decisions for yourself and bear the fruits of that and the consequences. So I think that would be my main characteristics of Waldo Emerson's poetry. I think it's a beautiful, the book itself, this biography is a nice intro into poetry. I think it opens up people's eyes to poetry. That's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful historic account of the first part of basically 2/3 of the 19th century America, which is, it's incredibly important to understand where a country comes from. And we read so much about Washington, Hamilton, and this intellectual backbone that people like Emerson built, and Thoreau and Whitman and others in that time. I think it's incredibly useful to know this. And I think most importantly, the intellectual Declaration of Independence really means that we have a choice. We depend on ourselves. Our actions reflect our minds. We decide. We have the responsibility. And I think the last thing I want to say is also there's a very David Deutschian argument here. The observations are theory laden. We see nature through the eyes of our own consciousness. Our mind determines and shapes the world. And we will actually determine and shape the world unless we destroy ourselves, because that's the power we have. That's the power that we've been given by nature for whatever reason, the ability to change things, to change our environment. We did that ever since we grew up in the steppes of East Africa. We changed the environment, we built cities, bridges, computers, and we will keep doing that. That's a power we have. Deutsch calls it explanatory power. Popper calls it, fallibilism, the ability to fix bad theories, make better theories, replace bad solutions with better solutions. That is a driving force, and Emerson is absolutely on board with that idea. Of course, he, as the intellectual father of American dynamism, of American individualism, of American accountability and responsibility, as the intellectual father, he would subscribe to all of these things. And of course, he would also have a word to say about ethics and morals. And the ethics and the morals of life, they have to be, like he says, all truths have to be true always. He's Kantian in a way that he does see a way to act good, and that good should also manifest itself throughout time and history. It shouldn't be circumstantial. So he's definitely not a relativist or some sort of woke, postmodern fatalist. None of that. So I guess, again, I think Waldo Emerson is the intellectual father of the America that we all love and fight to protect. He's an amazing poet. So just as an artist, I think he's to be cherished. And he's also an account of history, which is not to underestimate. It's an important part of history, American history, the first part of the 19th century, that has a big, big stamp of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thank you.